Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. I'm really excited to introduce the second panel of this distinguished forum. I think it's a really interesting transition into another really key element of Iraq's future economic development. And I'll start by saying a little bit more about each panelist. Directly on my right, we have Mothanna Gharaibeh, who is the former and first sitting Minister of Digital Economy and Entrepreneurship. It was a new office created in Jordan specifically for the purpose of encouraging that sector. He's also the chairman of the board of two new companies, Nova and Injaz, with the express purpose of creating 5,000 new jobs for Jordanians in the tech sector. And to his right is Sherri Kraham Talabany, President Executive Director of SEED Foundation. SEED is a local NGO that started 8 years ago, working with survivors of violence and those at risk. Before joining SEED, she spent 15 years as a human rights lawyer with the US government. And to her right is Mustafa Dawood. Good to see you again. He is the executive director of The Station, a newly appointed role. Started in Baghdad. It is a startup incubator and co-working space that now operates in 2 federal regions of Iraq. It has locations in Baghdad, Mosul, and has been operating in Erbil for the last 2 years. So congratulations to you all on your accomplishments. So we're going to talk here today about digital transformation, specifically in the KRI at Iraq, but we'll also take a regional focus. I think it's a very timely topic, especially because of the COVID-19 pandemic. We have all experienced from all our respective standpoints just how much COVID-19 impacted our use of digital technology in daily life. I think that nowhere was this change more marked than in the Middle East region, where in 2021, new funding for startups more than tripled, but also exposed critical gaps in access and affordability of end devices and internet packages. And I would add that the most recent updates to that is because of the war in Ukraine and because of the inflation and resulting interest rate constrictions in the United States, much of that foreign investment that we saw come in 2021 has significantly reduced, but consequently, new startups are still eager to exit given the lower amount of early stage funding, but there's been a large amount of acquisitions from within the region, which is an interesting shift, especially driven by Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Egypt. So this could be the beginning of an interesting consolidation of the tech market, but as I mentioned at the beginning, many of those gaps in how we address the most vulnerable, many of those gaps in how we provide internet access to rural areas and the poor are still serious drags on how digital transformation is going to proceed. So I think there could not be a better panel of experts who can walk us through all of these issues together. And so I wanted to start the panel by asking, kind of addressing where we're at today and where we've been. And to bring the focus to this area, I wanted to start over there with Mustafa. And my first question to you is, as the head of an incubator, there probably is no 2 groups more important to driving the digital transformation than youth and entrepreneurs, especially in the Middle East where there's a need for new businesses in that area. So how do you see the challenges facing entrepreneurs in Iraq? And if you could particularly address how will new regulatory changes in the Kurdistan region impact business creation, and how does that compare to the rest of federal Iraq?
Well, thank you so much, Alexander, and thanks for Rudaw for this wonderful event. I'm looking forward to see the other panels also. First of all, let me start with explaining one crucial difference between a startup and a regular business. because that has a lot of implication on what are the challenges for each of them, because they are entirely different. A startup is a business with a new innovative ideas. They create some kind of market disturbance. They are not like normal businesses. They have a tendency to high growth, fast growth, while regular businesses focus on established businesses that have more sustainability and they are more stable. In this, I will focus more on the challenges for digital SMEs who are tech empowered, who are digital, that are working in the KRG and the federal Iraq. The challenges for these can be mainly access to finance, infrastructure like internet, transportation, as well as education, which is one of the main elements for someone to develop the capacity to be able to establish a business. While startups are mainly focusing on education, education is the main challenge because it requires some kind of a mentality to create something that is new and will disturb the market, and it's mostly have to be focused on early stages. When it comes to the new policies, both KRG and federal Iraq are creating new policies, and we are seeing it in the Prime Minister office, we are seeing it in the parliament. There are a lot of policies that been established both in KRG and in federal Iraq. But the difference that I see has a lot of implication on the market is the implementation side of these policies. While we have similar policies in both federal Iraq and KRI, in KRI it is more we're seeing the implementation of it. That might be because of the quota system in the government in the federal Iraq, which is limiting the accuracy and the efficiency of the implementation. While in KRI, we are seeing this implementation happens and there are actual changes, whether on the side of supporting SMEs, enabling e-payments, and also changing the regulatory side in the government department and relying more on digital methods of collecting data and managing it. The impact of startups, I see it with changing the social norm, how people gonna react, how people gonna interact with technology, how they gonna use e-payments, which will create opportunities for startups. Well, entrepreneurs is someone who finds an opportunity, finds a problem, try to solve it, and get this opportunity to create his own business. While introducing a new technologies and a new digital way of purchasing, of finishing your work with the specific government department, with dealing with your commutes, with dealing with your daily purchases, this changes, creates an opportunity for the entrepreneur to actually establish their businesses and be more effective. And we're seeing that clearly in KRI developing and pushing forward. Yet there is one challenge that is need to be focused on in both regions, which is actual access to finance and the ability to get funding to grow your business, which is one of the main challenges for that is the registration, the ability to register, and to get your taxation right, which might be difficult for startups in their beginning. So I would say there are similar challenges in both regions, but the way I see it in the past few months, since December last year, when the Prime Minister of Kurdistan announced the new digital transformation strategy, they've been seeing some tangible impact, and I can see that is reflecting on the startups that we are working with. They have more plans, their implementation and business plans are being implemented more smoothly in KRI than federal Iraq. Last thing I would also like to mention is that access to finance is being also pushed in KRI through new initiatives by the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs, which I believe gonna bring a lot of help to the startups in their early stages. And I hope we can see the impact and the differences on the ecosystem soon.
Thank you, Mustafa. I think I was especially excited to see that the KRI proposed new electronic business registration, which I think we're seeing throughout the region. And Mothanna, I'd like to have you address that as well. But first, just as a quick follow-up to Mustafa, we were discussing briefly before the specific issues with access to finance, which I thought were really interesting. I thought you had an innovative approach to actually getting private bank capital to fund some startups. That's not something I've heard before happen throughout the region. But if you could touch on that, but also maybe just a really quick word on what the overall challenge is with getting banking capital to actually fund the early stage entrepreneurship scene.
Well, from a bank, if I put myself in a bank position and I see the giving a loan to a startup, it has some risk, especially that we don't have a credit record in Iraq. This hasn't been established, which pushes the bank to acquire more assurances from the startup or a personal loan before giving them the loan, which is in terms are creating more difficulties for the startups. There are two loans that we are working with the banks to give to the startup. There is the personal loan for the unregistered startups, which requires someone who is working in the government, or requires you have an asset to be assured by the bank itself so you can get the loan. The other way is for loans for businesses, but the difficulties with that is registration. You have to have a clearance from the tax authority, as well as you have to be registered so you can get a business loan, which is not easy for most of the startups. That is why it's becoming more difficult and difficult for startups to get loans. What I'm seeing as a good approach that the KRG are implementing is that the government itself is giving these assurances to the banks through the Ministry of Labor, so the banks can more easily give loans to startup without complicated regulations, because the assurance is provided by the government itself, which is a very good approach that I hope it can work and can implement positive changes, and it is something that can be also implemented in federal Iraq.
Right. I think that does sound very innovative, being able to back those loans by government guarantees. But I wanted to move the conversation over to you, Mothanna. So as the first sitting director of the Ministry of Entrepreneurship, how was your first approach in creating a whole of government approach to encouraging entrepreneurship?
Thank you, Alexander. Good morning, everybody. First of all, I'm super delighted to be back in Kurdistan after, maybe 13 years. I was here early 2008, and I was part of the team who built KRI. So I'm so proud to be here and see all the progress that happened in Kurdistan all those years. Yes, when I joined the government, it was Ministry of ICT, Ministry of Information Technology and Communication, and we decided in Jordan, with great support from His Majesty, to transform, because we need to be forward-looking. We followed the moonshot approach that ICT is the infrastructure of the past, and we need to be in the future. And to do that, we need startups and small businesses to create change in the country and to use technology as a tool for justice. We're a small country. We're 11 million people, 35% are refugees. We are a small country. We use technology, and that's what we believed in, that it could create opportunities when resources are scarce. We don't have oil, we don't have gas, we don't have anything but people. And those people can be accessible through technology to serve global businesses. And that was the vision when we created the ministry. And we can happily report that on the last 3 years, we have 19% growth in digitally enabled jobs year over year in Jordan, serving global businesses. That's for the global businesses, but also that global businesses that are being served from Jordan are creating talent and experience and knowledge that can serve the smaller startups, and they are actually seeds to grow startups from Jordan. Those people who work in Microsoft, Amazon, they learn something that they cannot learn in any company, and they build their own startups. And we're happy that we just had an exit of 200 million of a gaming startup in Jordan, a cards game that people played very well during COVID. When people were locked at home, everybody was playing that cards game. It suddenly became 200 million. So a startup could create impact for a lot of people by just giving them the opportunity. And that's what people lack in this part of the world, in Jordan, Iraq, Erbil, and everywhere. They just need opportunity. And what Mustafa said about access to finance, that's a big challenge. Luckily, the previous government, before I joined, has acted, and we created the ISF, which I sit on the board, which is the Innovative SMEs and Startup Fund, which is a $100 million fund with the Central Bank, World Bank, that created 14 funds, and we just signed another fund yesterday to nurture startups at their early stage. So the vision was to give people opportunity, they will deliver. Smart people in this part of the world have been overcoming many challenges all through the years. Technology now is there as a bridge to the universe to be able to serve the global opportunities.
And on creating employment and global opportunities, I thought it's interesting. Now that you've transitioned back to the private sector, you have been directing these companies as chairman to help target the global technology market. So what is your strategy for doing that? How do you sell Jordan as the place to go for hiring some of that?
Well, we have a good story. I mean, I don't think Jeff Bezos hires in Jordan for charity. He doesn't do that. Or Microsoft, or Cisco, or Juniper, or Expedia, or PwC. Those companies have been growing by hundreds in the last 3 years. That happens because of a fact that Jordan is the right place to be, because we have the talent, we have the infrastructure, and we have the ecosystem. We don't tax exported services. We have, I mean, our biggest problem is the solution for all the global markets. We have an army of graduates who have the right talent, the hunger to work, but they don't have opportunities because the economy size is small. Mm-hmm. So they wouldn't be working in Jordan. They would be working from Jordan to serve the global market. I mean, that's not only in technology, by the way. Technology is a tool, as I said, for justice. I have right now, almost in 6 years, we're going to double the number of doctors in Jordan. The medical doctors, they're going to be doubled in 6 years. How are they going to find jobs in Jordan? That's not possible. But we can help all the aging nations on earth by primary health care through telemedicine. Those thousands of doctors could help people in the US, in Northern Europe, wherever, giving them primary health care using technology. Because technology right now, and with the COVID experience, it was sad that we lost so many dear ones in those tough years. But it was a stress test, and it's an examination of our capacity to work remotely, to work from home, to work and serve everybody. And I mean, day one lockdowns, and Jordan lockdowns were serious lockdowns, we managed to serve our global markets, and we've been tested. I mean, Cisco hired 250 engineers in 2 weeks, and they work from their homes, serve their global customers, 60% females, from 6 governors, and they had the highest customer satisfaction index for the Cisco centers globally. So it works. We have a good story to tell. We just need to go and tell it to everybody out there.
Yeah, I think Jordan's really done a good job working on its brand, and much to your credit. Before I move to another round of questions more focused on COVID, I wanted to ask Sherri, you've been here in Kurdistan while the digital transformation is taking place, and this is more an issue of adaptation socially. So what have you observed in the past 10 years or more about how it's taken root here? And what are the impacts that are being had on the most vulnerable? You know, people are accessing online devices and online platforms ever before. We don't really discuss enough, I think, what the impact on them and what drives, frankly, a lot of people away from using these devices.
Thanks, Alex. Good morning, everybody. Bayantam Bash. So yes, we've seen a pretty rapid transformation in the digital space here in Kurdistan, not just 10 years ago when I moved here, but my first trip here was 1999, and that was under sanctions. It was under Saddam's time, and so Kurdistan was very, very isolated and disconnected from the rest of the world. So we, from that time where Kurdistan couldn't get, new medical textbooks, until now, until, post-2003, I think the world really opened up. And we've seen, almost the whole population, about 92% have access to mobile phones. Rudaw research says 68% are on social media. So a big part of the population is online. And of course, there are many benefits to this, as has been talked about, for business, for education, for social connection, for improving services and access to services. So all of that is a huge benefit and an opportunity, especially here in Kurdistan. We also have hugely talented and educated youth that are looking for work. So huge opportunities. But the risks of not just technology, but this sudden, also rapid transformation, I see that in two ways. One is about inclusion and access and literacy, and the other is about safety. So in terms of digital inclusion, there are people that are left behind by this transformation, and people that don't have access to services or may not have access to work or educational opportunities. And who are those people? Well, women are about 48% behind men in access to the internet. The data shows, and this is World Bank data, that 96 out of 100 women don't have the literacy to be able to use the internet, printers, and other technical devices. So we see that women could be left behind in this digital transformation. We also saw, you mentioned COVID, we also saw that the lack of internet access for poor populations, rural populations, impacted their ability to get online and do education during COVID, during the lockdown. So we see that some people just don't have access, or literacy is challenging their inclusion and their ability to fully participate in the economy and educational opportunities. Perhaps an even bigger risk is the risk of online violence. So we know that all of the kids and most of us are online, we're in social media. And so what we've seen is a dramatic rise in online violence, what we call technology-facilitated gender-based violence. So it's anybody could be susceptible to online violence, but we see it's mostly targeting the most vulnerable, women and girls. And the kind of violence that we're seeing, it starts online, but then it goes to, as my kids say, IRL, in real life, right? It's real life violence. And the kind of violence that we're seeing is exploitation. So photo manipulation or blackmailing and extortion, use of photos and videos. We're seeing massive, massive harassment against women and girls. Even you see it in the public space with politicians and academics, and you see, again, you see that online violence shift quickly to real life violence. So we have real protection risks and a real need to increase safe use of internet technology.
And following up on the phenomenon of online violence, what's your specific approach? Who do you address first, and what are the different sides of the equation that need to be talked to in terms of bringing those incidences of violence down?
Yeah, so about a year ago, SEED started under the rubric of the UN Humanitarian Cluster System. We started a task force that's still continuing to today. It's the only such sort of nationwide task force in the world that focuses on online violence technology facilitated GBV, and we're made up of NGOs and UN agencies, and we're trying to bring government as well. And our focus is really looking at the legislative protections, and we don't want to legislate what people say, as we're seeing some new regulations circulating from Baghdad. That's really harmful. We're not talking about freedom of expression and people to have the ability to express themselves and their opinions, but we're talking about crimes and violence which is happening online. So we need legislation and regulations, and we need government institutions to be able to prevent, protect, and investigate these crimes. And so this is a major part of our work, analyzing what kind of legal protections exist in the world, and there's many laws in Europe and the Middle East to draw from to foster and promote online technology, but also to ensure that the crimes that are happening online, that people have access to protection. So that's one part of it. The second part is awareness. So we in my organization do lots of work with young people to create awareness of the risks online. And we're hoping to bring this into the schools, because we think this is a real tragedy that's happening. The risks are going up dramatically for young people. What else can we do? We're working with the big tech, so Meta we work with and others to try to build more accountable mechanisms. So if you are being abused or harassed online, there's some complaints mechanism and some way to remove that dangerous and nasty content. So, legislative and regulatory protections and institutions that know how to prevent and protect public awareness and self knowledge about how to keep myself safe, and then finding those mechanisms, strengthening those mechanisms in the tech company so that we're not vulnerable here in Iraq. And other countries that have this have much stronger protection mechanisms. Facebook and others are much more responsive when there's a law in the country that they can be held accountable to. They don't want to lose their access to all the users in Iraq. So, these things are very tied together.
Thank you for that. And I wanted to, before we move on to questions, I wanted to ask another quick round on COVID. So it's important to note the transformations that happened, and I want to kind of hear from you anecdotally. What did you see during the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of how, from your respective positions, people were able to adapt, and what are the permanent changes that you think have taken root? And Mothanna, I wanted to start from you because you were Minister of Digital Economy when COVID happened. So what was your approach as a ministry, and what were some of the organic changes that people made in their daily lives to enable survival at this critical time? You mentioned that the lockdowns in Jordan were very severe, and for a good reason. But could you speak a little bit more about how you approached that from a governmental perspective?
Thank you, Alexander. Maybe the best thing that happened during COVID that we have QR code. You have QR coded the economy in a way. We had QR payments and we have QR permits. I mean, if people needed to move around Jordan during lockdown, they needed to have a digital permit that's QR based. So the police now understands what's a QR code. And that was not easy. I mean, with normal conditions, I don't think there are many countries on earth where police would understand QR code. And that resulted that now, if you are driving your car and the policeman asks you for your driver license, you can take a QR code from your mobile and they will take that as your driving license or your ID. So that would not have happened without COVID. Mm-hmm. It's happened because of hard work from the ministry's team and the Ministry of Interior team and the overall ecosystem. But I mean, accepting such kind of things, that was not possible. And education, I mean, to democratize access to proper education is not easy. Education is a huge investment, and you cannot give the best teacher to every student in Jordan or in any country that on a classroom. But technology allows you to have that. We have startups in Jordan that started during COVID and helped us to provide online education to everybody in Jordan who had access to internet. There was a portion without access, unfortunately. But this startup is now working in Iraq, in Egypt. It acquired a startup in Pakistan, and they're providing tutoring online. So health, I mean, I mentioned the telemedicine thing. I mean, let me tell you a small story. I had a call from the Prime Minister at the time, Dr. Omar Razaz, and it was 8 o'clock at night. I said, Mothanna, I called the hotline for the Ministry of Health, and I waited for 15 minutes, and this should not happen. I need somebody who answers within 3 to 5 minutes, and Jordanians deserve a better quality. I said, okay, consider it done. I don't know how I said consider it done. So I said, I'll find a way. I'll find a startup to make it happen. That's why I got a call with Al-Tibbi, which is a Jordanian startup. Mm-hmm. Day 2, 12 o'clock at noon, I mean, less than one working day, we had doctors answering the phone within 3 to 5 minutes to all Jordanians who had a question about COVID. Imagine if we did not have that, they would have been calling 911 and bombarding the system, which will stop the police from being able to answer real emergencies. So technology created that kind of beliefs that it is doable. You just need to have enough guts to make it happen and allow the startups and the smart, innovative people in the country to do it on your behalf. Governments cannot do it alone. They cannot use the tools of yesterday to fight the battles of tomorrow. There are much more challenging situations that requires technology, innovation, and not thinking outside the box. It's destroying the whole box because it doesn't work. You need those smart people to help you to make it happen.
I think that's really interesting that education and health are now moving more online than ever. I would just add that I think in last year's investment report, health tech and ed tech were two of the most sought after investments in MENA startups because of the scale of expansion there. But Mustafa, I wanted to move over to you on that issue of startups. I mean, the station is primarily there not just to incubate new ideas, but also for the youth. How did they adapt, and how did some of maybe the people coming to the station, I mean, the station just started right before COVID-19, so I think you had a pretty unique perspective on how many people started to see entrepreneurship differently.
First of all, the COVID-19 pandemic is a very complicated matter. I think it's a milestone worldwide. It has changed a lot of things, and the implication of COVID-19 we're still seeing till today. There are still things that are changing because the COVID-19 pandemic. Well, to address that, I need to discuss first the short-term and the long-term impact on startups. And to be able to put that effectively, I have to break it down by sectors. When you come to establish a startup, it depends on the sector and whether the sector is progressing or COVID is resulting in the sector to be locked down. For example, if you come to transportation or hair riding during COVID have had a major hit. They lost a lot of their employees. They have to let down a lot of their drivers and staff because there basically was no market. When it comes to e-commerce, someone would think, yeah, e-commerce would have flourished, but actually no. E-commerce had also got a hit because delivery was also a challenge. What actually the sectors that have, let's say, progressed during COVID is the online education, the food transportation, the food delivery, as well as the online entertainment services. And I think Mr. Mothanna also mentioned one of the startups in Jordan who have entered Iraq and benefited and progressed during COVID, which is Jawakar, that recently had got an investment. What happened is the long-term impact after COVID. You know, during COVID, people were staying at home, using their phones most of the times, getting more familiar with technologies, getting to know more apps. After COVID, when the lockdown was lifted, people kept this habit of using technology more, which has created opportunities for a startup to acquire and penetrate this market. And after COVID, just a few months after it, a lot of businesses in e-commerce and hair riding started doubling their revenue and getting more and more income. And the effect also comes because it's like dominoes. Like one thing happened and led to a lot of other things. The startups who has benefit after COVID and even food delivery and online entertainment during COVID have created some kind of a success story that been able to double their revenue, get more income to them. So they created a success story for digital startups and technology empowered businesses that led more and more startups and more youth to come to the station, to come to incubators, to actually do the same that they have done. They want to be like them. They want to implement the same way they have done. And they've been reading about the successes that they have achieved, which have led to, from my perspective as an incubator, a lot of businesses, a lot of youth have been more and more interested in starting tech-based companies after COVID. But the changes are still happening till now. There are still impact on the economy due to COVID, and still there are a lot of businesses, and I'm saying that about hundreds of SMEs that still till the moment are effective and are still been able to recover after COVID. So I would say it is positive, but has some negative implications.
Right. Sherri, the next question goes to you, but just quickly before I ask, I just wanted to send another reminder to the audience. If you would like to submit a question, the number you can WhatsApp is 964-750-530-0009. And Sherri, same question to you.
Sure.
What did you notice in COVID, and being that you're focused and you're very concentrated on a lot of the negative impacts of online interaction. Did that happen to increase as well?
Yeah, so the two risks that I talked about just before were exacerbated under COVID. So the first one about access, inclusion. So who was left behind during COVID? People with, poor people that don't have access were left out of education. I saw in our own work, because we're a human rights organization, we do a lot of training of government officials. Most of the people that we spend our time with are law enforcement and police. So when we went to move our training online, they didn't have computers, they didn't have printers, they didn't have emails to get the core content. So we had to train our trainees on how to use the computer and internet and emails and create email accounts for them. So, we saw that they were really didn't have the digital literacy needed to go online. So we are leaving people behind when we move so rapidly. We've got to think about how everybody has access. And then the other piece, and I mentioned about education, how people were really isolated. And so what we saw socially, that the protection risks went up. So violence went up. Gender-based violence during COVID more than doubled and increased rapidly. And that's because people were isolated at home with no access to the outside world, huge economic stressors. And so violence, domestic violence went up dramatically. Human trafficking, people were stuck at home, no access to help. And then we saw online violence increase. So everybody shifted and pivoted to the online space. Young people without school are mostly online. And it increased the harassment, the online violence, the technology-facilitated GBV that we talked about before. So, under these really challenging times, we saw these two risks really blow up and exacerbate the vulnerabilities of people that were already very vulnerable.
Right. And I think that's very interesting that you came in prepared to talk about the problem of violence and how to deal with it, but then the actual law enforcement didn't have the digital means to actually track down the issue. So did SEED have to step in?
That's another issue. Yeah. So, one of the challenges in decreasing online violence is the capacity among law enforcement institutions to do real investigations, forensic analysis, online investigations, and find evidence of these online crimes. So this is a challenge to people that are being exploited through the photos and the videos. I'll just give you one example. We went to security forces, not the fabulous GBV police that we have here, DCVAL, but to another security force. And when they opened the guy's phone, they had hundreds of women's photos. He was exploiting many, many women. So we really need the skills to be able to investigate these kinds of crimes. And if you don't have a police force that's digitally literate, that's going to be really challenging.
And two quick follow-ups before I move to questions. I think we'll get to that in the last 15 or so minutes. How do we legislate that? How do we deal with abuse directly in the online space? So
I think it's really important that we don't legislate and control and police people's feelings, what people say, how they look, right? If I want to put my photo up and my opinion, we don't need a law, and this is what's percolating in Baghdad right now. We don't need a law to control that, right? What we need a law to do is to legislate crimes. So online abuse, harassment, extorting someone, those are all crimes in the Iraqi Penal Code. So those are the kinds of things that need to be adapted. We need to recognize the forms of online violence, the forms of evidence that can be used in these kinds of cases. And we need to ensure that there's an institution that is responsible, because right now there's a lot of institutions working on it, but no key institution is responsible. And we need to make sure that people that are abused and survivors of online violence have access to services. And so these are the three elements of a good law. Yeah, defining the crime, defining the institution, who's responsible, how people can get help, and what kind of services they're entitled to.
That's very clear. The clear steps that need to be taken. And Mothanna, I wanted to repack that a little bit over to you, and maybe just a minute, and we'll get some audience questions. But I think when I see MENA governments approach a really bewildering environment of digital platforms that's growing every day, and they're coming from abroad and they're being created here. How should, and when you were in your experience as minister, or maybe your just general observations, how should governments be approaching this environment of online platforms, especially when there are real security concerns?
It's a very tough question. First of all, we need to remember that the users are in a different age and time. And legislators do not get them or understand the language they speak or the way they feel and what gets them excited and what does not. So sometimes we legislate for a different generation that has, they don't care. Even if you legislate, they find their ways to go around it. And that's a very tough challenge. That's a global challenge, by the way. Legislators in all countries on this planet are too old to understand what's needed, including myself. I'm in my 40s, but I still believe that I'm old to understand what the 23-year-old boys and girls are trying to do with technology. And that makes it very sophisticated. When I was in the government, we tried to do the data privacy law. We made the draft following global best practices, following more the American, Canadian. GDPR was too tough to implement even in Europe, so we tried to take the American, Canadian part of it. Cybercrime law, we tried to change the law to make it more reflecting whatever happens in real life is reflected in that law, but the parliament did not approve that law, so we don't own the authority to do that. The elected parliament members are the people who can change the laws. We can only propose, and they rejected that. So we really need to think of a way where we include the younger people who are using the technology, who are digitally native, to be part of the process, because we're going to do something that doesn't work. If we just do it alone, it's not going to work.
Yeah, very important points that I think all governments in the area around the world need to take note of. So let's move to some audience questions. We actually have a few in. So the first one actually is for you, Your Excellency. So you mentioned the number of doctors in Jordan might, I think, double in 6 years.
Yes.
How is digital transformation going to provide the same benefits to those doctors as traditional medical doctors?
It's not going to be the same. We need to rethink the way those doctors will find jobs. If we don't act and find them opportunities digitally, they either need to leave the country or they will become Uber drivers or cashiers. That's what will happen. Those are doctors that there are not enough sick people for them to treat in Jordan. So that's why telemedicine could be the tool for them to help countries where there are shortage of skilled doctors who can help people, at least in primary healthcare, till technology takes us forward to more sophisticated stuff, which is there now, but the cost is too high. But simply, primary healthcare can be the solution for them. They're not going to work like normal doctors. They're not going to be the same way of doing business. It's not possible. Physically, there are limitations on resources, on time, on infrastructure that would not allow them the same opportunity, unfortunately.
Thank you, Mothanna. And quick note to the panel, if you have any specific additions to any of these questions, please jump in, but I'll try to direct them for now. A second question, and this one is interesting, how can digital transformation itself narrow the access gap? And I would add to that maybe especially in terms of pricing, that's one thing that keeps people away. And for example, women who typically have lesser access to digital technologies, what are some of the digital solutions that can actually help offer them access to that? And Sherri, this can be for anyone, but let's start with you. I think we have a mic out.
There we go.
Okay.
So I think increasing digital access is critically important to improving the lives of marginalized groups. So we can increase young people's access to safety information or to information about their bodies or about their decision making and empowerment information. So I think it's really important for young people to have access. I think it could increasing access could increase people's access to services that they may not be able to support. We could also think about reaching human trafficking survivors. We can create an online application for somebody, human trafficking is in secret, right? It's behind closed doors. So if you had an application where you can report that you're a domestic worker here in Kurdistan and you're in harm's way, you can report those kinds of crimes. So I think we have to do it very intentionally. I think we have to invest. I think we have a huge responsibility as we digitize to improve people's digital literacy, and I would start in the public schools. I know my kids in school are working on computers. I mean, they obviously know way more than me about how to operate online, but I think making sure that all kids here in Kurdistan have that. And since we're just talking about marginalization and inclusion, I just want to say I see Nelson Mandela's nephew is now in the audience, and I'm a huge fan. I grew up, before I became a human rights lawyer, I used to march through my high school with Free Mandela signs. And so it's very cool that you're here. Thank you. Sorry.
And thank you for recognizing. We are honored to have you here today. Before we move on from that question, Mothanna, one thing that I think is very important is access and affordability. How did the ministry or the government of Jordan, how did it see the rural-urban divide in digital access? And was there any specific solutions in terms of access to end devices and access to data?
Yeah, I don't claim we've done what's needed to make it happen, but the government of Jordan invested in the National Broadband Network, which is a fiber network reaching every school in every village in Jordan. And that creates at least access inside the school. But was it well used? Not yet. But we introduced through a new program, which is called Youth Technology and Jobs, a program to educate boys and girls in public schools digital skills. And that could be the beginning of getting them more involved. I believe technology, internet is a public good. It's like utilities now. You cannot live without internet. You need to have it like electricity or water. Luckily, because of competition, prices of technology has been dropping down in Jordan. I mean, we used to pay much more, 10 times as much 10 years ago compared to what we pay today. But still, there are poor people who did not have access to education online during the COVID, and that were the plan, His Majesty actually, and we had a plan to buy computers for the poor children and give them internet to be able to get education instead of watching that school on TV. But then COVID went down a little bit, so they went back to schools. So maybe sometimes I wish COVID stayed a bit longer so we could have bought those 100,000 computers to the poor kids in Jordan. But there were plans. We have that national broadband network in every school in Jordan connected to fiber internet. So part of it is done, but we need more.
And what do you think, in terms of data, what do you think the best intervention is? Should we subsidize people's access to data? And there's also an infrastructure challenge in the Middle East in terms of building the data centers and reducing the IP costs.
Those are two things, access to data or access to internet, because data is a total different story. I mean, we need open data. We need it to be accessible through APIs that people can generate smart ideas around them. I mean, if you get, for example, the health data, if you have the health data open for startups that Mustafa can play with, I mean, you could create ways to optimize the cost of health in Jordan. I mean, knowing what's the average stay in hospitals, what's the percentage of consumables versus human capital versus energy versus medicines, what is the time needed per patient from doctors. So you could dimension much more. I mean, data is a total different story, access to data. And we created an open API policy to access data and government transactions that we created the policy, still not under heavy use. We need to push people more for usage and subsidize that cost. But access to internet, yes, it should be subsidized. It should be a public good. And actually, the global internet companies that are making money out of people's data should subsidize that access. I mean, Facebook, Google, whatever, all those companies are making a lot of money from the usage that we pay for. So they could, and they have started some small things, but I mean, the money they're making out of those countries, of every country on earth, should be sufficient to subsidize people's access to data. And they will make money out of it anyway.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. That's a win-win. Here's a question I think is best suited for Mustafa. How can digital banking benefit SMEs, NGOs, and entrepreneurs? What would that transition look like?
Well, digital banking can benefit all businesses in general, not just the startups and entrepreneurs. First of all, it saves cost. For example, if you are a delivery company or a B2B delivery company, even when you deliver your goods or your products or your services to certain people, currently it is cash-based. So you have to deliver the goods, to deliver the materials to your customers, and then collect the cash. And that implicate like a lot of expenditures to be able to pay the service providers, to pay the vendors before actually collecting the cash from the end customer, which is putting a lot of pressure on a lot of e-commerce companies, food delivery companies, even small businesses that have just social media pages, which is limiting a lot of people from continuing that path. I know a large number of SMEs and small businesses that we have been working in. They closed because of the digital banking issue, because of they cannot afford purchasing materials and having to wait for a month or even more to collect these payments from the end customers because it's a cash-based. And on the top of that, they have to afford more even expenditures. For example, even an edtech company in the south have subscribers from rural areas, from villages, from the, towns all across Iraq. They have to pay a company that is specialized to go in their places, in their towns, to collect the payments on the subscriptions, which is a huge challenge. Having a digital payment and digital banking can make the process quite easy. It will give accessibilities to everyone to establish their own businesses. So definitely, this is a core need. Also, I would like to say something after what Mr. Mothanna said about data. I think one of the main important things for entrepreneurs when they are trying to establish their businesses, one of the main challenges is the lack of data. For example, if I want to start my own business and to design my new product and my new service, when we work with entrepreneurs, they have to conduct a market research, and the market research will decide what type of services they can get. And you cannot imagine how difficult it is for a young entrepreneur to get the right answers from the market so he can design his business on. In exchange, what they are doing currently is, because of the lack of data, they are going to the market, failing to actually build their business correctly. So I think data is crucial for any business to succeed, so they can get the answers for their questions before launching their businesses and their products.
Right. Excuse me, sorry. So another question for Sherri and the Seed Foundation. You mentioned taking regulatory steps for prevention of GBV, but what specific measures have been taken, need to be taken to specifically to target and punish the violators?
Yeah, so I think one of the challenges with holding people accountable for these crimes, and exploitation is already a crime under the anti-trafficking law, and gender-based violence or sexual assault and rape, those are already existing crimes. I think what the challenge is in protecting people is that they need their identity protected. Nobody wants to come forward if everybody will know who they are. We have a very traditional, conservative, honor-based system here, and so the risk that young women are facing here means that they don't feel safe accessing support services. And police often don't know how to deal with these crimes. They don't have the ability to investigate these crimes. So I think the legislation really should identify who is responsible for supporting. They have to do it in a survivor-centered way, so protecting the confidentiality and the privacy of the victim, and not exposing that person to greater honor-based violence within their community or their home. And so that has to be done in a certain way. So the first step is the legislation. The second step is building institutional capacity within a key institution, and people know who that is and how to get help. And there are many, many viable institutions here in Kurdistan already working on sensitive issues of domestic violence and other types of crimes against women and girls. So I think there are some real big opportunities. I think it's a very, very big rising crime. I think we all know cases in the communities that we work in where somebody is at risk, and it impacts everybody. It's not poor girls or wealthy girls. It's just everybody in between. We had a huge case of exploitation at one of the private universities here. So this crime is happening to everybody. And so it is really a dramatic social issue that we need to address here. And sorry, it's not just in Kurdistan. It's all across Iraq and all across the Middle East and all across the world in the U.S. where I'm from as well.
Yeah, no, it's the inclusivity challenge and the GBV challenge is universal. That's absolutely true. And the last question here before we maybe move on to some final thoughts, I think is best for Mothanna. This is interesting. You mentioned that the policymakers and the youth who are driving digital transformation are from different generations. They understand this world completely differently. And you mentioned briefly also that we need to bring them in. We need to bring them in to properly legislate and enable the digital transformation while also addressing security concerns. Whose responsibility should it be to educate these policymakers, make sure that they're aware of cybersecurity and they're able to address these challenges in an inclusive and growth-minded way?
It's a mutual responsibility. Policymakers need to be responsible to be up to date with the future trends, and those young people, they need to earn their position on the table. I mean, no authority on earth would give you the right to change the status quo by its own. I mean, they will always need to hear you, and you need to be allowed to be able to take your point of view into consideration. So those young people, they need to make sure that they're well heard, and policies that do not work with them are not followed. I mean, sorry, they need to be disruptive, so they need to create a problem for policymakers to solve. Otherwise, they will just continue to be in a total different disconnect. They need to be active members in the society, in the political scene, and they need to make enough noise for the policymakers to hear that.
Yeah.
And I need to say, I have Mandela's photo in my living room, so it's great to see.
And I think we should move to. We have a few minutes left. We might be able to take one or two more questions. And so one that we have is social media created a rapid base. I'm sorry, I don't know if I understand exactly how this one. This one I think is more appropriate to finish with. Until now, we don't have a Data Protection Act. How can we digitalize if we don't have these regulations in place? I think this is an interesting question because digital transformation is happening with or without laws in place. And Mustafa, you spoke a little bit about the regulations. And if you could all join in and say, well, what are going to be the impacts of long-term digital transformation if we don't make these changes and these laws?
Well, this is a very important question. I think there are a million changes that can happen due to digital transformation. And data protection is one of the main important things that we have to keep in mind from now. Data is a very sensitive thing for any business, for any startup. Their transaction, how they are developing their product, their added value that they are giving to the market. So if we imagined ourselves in a fully digital world where all the startups have their data on the cloud and they are working, there is a competition in the market. And without data protection, that can be very, let's say, aggressive between businesses to compete on data. So I think data production itself, when it comes to entrepreneurship, it is about problem solving. It's about someone who identify a problem and solve it. So the answer, I think, is data protection itself will come a sector, will be a sector that businesses will thrive in. And I think we are seeing that from now in the West and in Europe and also in China. There are a lot of companies will be specialized to protect the data of both personal and businesses. And as long as we are progressing and we are transforming more into digital communication and digital ways and have more data on the cloud, this will be a rising need, and we will have more and more companies to enter that sector. So I don't think it's something to worry about data protection. I think we will have methods to solve it. I'm very optimistic about digital transformation, and I see it's the only way forward, and all the concern will be resolved in the future.
And I think we all share that optimism, very much so. I think that's all the time we have, so I would like to invite a round of applause for the panel for your excellent responses and expertise. Thank you.